everyone. I'm the big new star of the big new movie, Gremlins 2, The New Batch. And here's someone very special to tell you all about it.
Boy, this is a really good movie.
And there you have it, unsolicited testimonial from Gizmo himself. So listen to Gizmo. You know he'd never lie to anyone.
Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Here they grow again. Rated PG-13. Starts Friday, June 15th at a theater near you. We told you the rules.
You can't get them wet.
Don't let them eat after midnight.
It's always midnight somewhere.
You didn't listen. Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Rated PG-13. Starts Friday, June 15th at a theater near you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Pantheon Plus here on the Real World Podcasting Network. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. Here tonight on Pantheon Plus, we are going to be discussing the first of my 4 underrated sequels, 1990's Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Please leave a 4 or 5 star review here to let the folks know what we are doing here at the Real World. If you would like to get in contact with us, please do so by connecting with us on Twitter for now at Hero Pantheon. You can also find other podcasts that we've been doing, including our crossover with Ben and Matt and the Marvelous Journey. We ranked all 40 Marvel projects, so definitely go check that out. Over 2 hours of podcasting goodness there. You can listen to Ben and I give our top 10 movies of 2022. And you can also hear my co-host for this podcast, Brian, and I discussing the first 3 underrated sequels, or the first 2. This is number 3. Again, it's Gremlins 2. You can follow my partner in crime at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, we are going to be discussing the Gremlins 2 sequel. Ben and Matt, as part of their There Will Be Movie series, they discussed Gremlins 1. So if you want to go hear some perspective on that film, please go do that. But here we're going to be talking about this as kind of an underrated sequel. What makes Gremlins 2 an underrated sequel is the fact that it is very different in tone compared to the first one. Many of the same cast members have returned, but there are also a number of key differences in the fact that this goes to New York, and the fact that it is it's less dark, even though there's still some darkness that's going there. But Brian, I have to tell you, I recall this being an underrated sequel because I remember watching this movie, even though it is very different from the first one, and really liking it. But I was very, very happy rewatching this past week, and I love this movie, man. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it is as good as Gremlins 1984, because I think that movie does such a tremendous job of mixing in the comedy and the horror elements. This is like a gonzo comedy horror. Like, the comedy is definitely put before the horror, even though there's still some dark moments, but this is so much more comedic in nature, and I love this movie, Brian. That's all I could say.
I love it too, man. When I was a kid, I watched this movie on repeat a lot. I was just so confused as why is Hulk Hogan in my VHS player when I was 3 or 4 years old. But man, just this movie is so wacky and fun. I remember having the picture book too, and just going through that as a kid and being fascinated with the designs of the creatures. And I still remember looking at the picture of the vegetable gremlin and just being just shaking and just having this thing about and then going to Sizzler when I'm 6 years old and looking around and oh my God, that's the thing from Gremlins 2, the salad bar. So I was kind of haunted about salad bars for a good portion of my childhood because of that. Just that fucking gremlin with the vegetable on his face. I swear to God, that scared me, but I laughed a lot at this movie too. I thought they got way creative with it. You know what I mean? And that's sometimes that's what I want with a sequel. It's like we have the concept. The first one was great. Let's just have fun, And this is exactly that. And they had a lot of fun. And you talk about the tone being a little different. I would say that this is definitely a lighter tone, but I still think it has this great creativity behind it, especially when all the gremlins are drinking all the random chemicals and turning into these random monsters. Like, that was great. I'll always remember that as a kid. For a movie that's probably like Gremlins, I would say is not necessarily orientated towards kids. It seems like it, but it takes this really dark horror turn and dark towards the middle, especially when the mom kills all those gremlins. That's not for kids. And I watched that as a kid and I was like, whoa, this is not what I expected. Because I watched Gremlins 2 before Gremlins 1. Because I was born in '88, so the VHS of Gremlins 2 came out like, what, 91? So I was 4 years old, perfect timing. And then I watched Gremlins later on, and then I was like, man, I think Gremlins 2 is just much more fun and thinking back on it. But yeah, Joe Dante, hell of a job. I think it might be his only sequel, come to think of it. And if I were to rank the Joe Dante movies, it just might be Gremlins 1 and 2 at the top. Like, I'm not a big Howling fan, and I love werewolf movies because, American Werewolf in London is like one of my top 3 horror movies of all time, personally. But I don't know. That first Howling movie doesn't work for me, but somehow Joe Dante was able to pull it together for Gremlins 1 and then just let loose for Gremlins 2, so I really appreciate that. And goddamn, all the cameos and Christopher Lee. I didn't realize the significance of Christopher Lee being casted until now because I'd watched Prince of Horror Dracula, the first Dracula Christopher Lee movie, like, I don't know, years ago. And then I didn't put 2 and 2 together about how they're connected to, or how it's connected to the end of Gremlins, the first Gremlins. Because basically, the end of the first Gremlins, they recreate the ending of Horror Dracula. Instead of, Christopher Lee being the one melting, it's the gremlin that melts, right? And then Billy grabs the shade or whatever, brings it down, and then he melts. That's exactly almost like shot for shot a copy of Horror Dracula. And then you bring in Christopher Lee in this movie, in a movie where they also have another guy playing a fake Dracula who's not Christopher Lee, which I thought even better. Like, man, they cast him, but they didn't cast him as the Dracula. So that was interesting as well. I kind of wish Peter Cushing was able to do the voice of the Brain Gremlin, but he wasn't available. I mean, I think he died like 4 years later. I think he died in '94, so he couldn't do it. But man, I think he would have done a better job. Even though I like the performance as it is, I think the Brain Gremlin with Peter Cushing would have been amazing because then you would have Peter Cushing talking to Christopher Lee, but in gremlin form. So
what makes it so good is that you have Robert Prosky playing the fake Dracula. I don't know. It's tough because I think every local area has like their like local horror legend. Elvira, I would say, is much more of a national figure. Brian, do you know? Have you heard of Svengoolie, or is that strictly a Chicago thing?
Oh, I've heard of it through social media, and he's pretty much the late night horror host. That's kind of like in Fright Night, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
So I think that's what they're going for. Like his grandpa
Definitely.
Fred, like visually he looks very much like a monster. Like that's what they're going for.
Definitely, and I just saw him because I watched Last Action Hero recently as well, and he's the old theater owner in that as well. And I was like, God damn, that's the Dracula dude from Gremlins 2. How did I not realize that when I was a kid when I watched those 2 movies? But I didn't realize that until now. But he's got probably a bigger career than we think, other than these 2 smaller roles that he had in the '90s. But he's definitely a memorable guy, a character actor. As a kid, you recognize that face, and it's just like, oh yeah, that's the guy from Last Action Hero. And then of course now he's the guy from Dracula. But I thought he did a good job for what he was, because that role is kind of like, I don't know, you could have played it wacky, but he kind of played it straight faced, didn't he? And that's kind of like a contrast to what's going on. And he's kind of like one of the few straight faced characters in the movie with all this chaotic shit going on around him.
I will also point out that he does a very good job. He plays the heavy in Heat, Thief, the other Michael Mann crime movie. I would definitely recommend people check that out because you are definitely going to get a very different perspective on Robert Prosky as a character actor if you watch the movie Thief. But let's talk about this sequel. So Gremlins 1984 was a huge success. Warner Brothers immediately wanted a sequel, but Joe Dante did not want to make this movie. He waited for a number of years Up until 1990, this movie came out. The movie was being worked on without him. Other writers and directors were talked to and discussed. There were a number of storylines that included sending the Gremlins to cities like Las Vegas or even Mars. After these ideas fell through, the studio finally asked Dante again, who agreed on the condition that he be allowed to do anything he wanted. He also received a bigger budget. In the DVD commentaries for both Gremlins and the sequel, Dante stated that he felt this movie was a case of waiting too long to capitalize on the success of Gremlins, which hurts this movie's chances of success. So it's funny because there's another 1984 movie, Ghostbusters, that also had a sequel just a year earlier, and in many ways that movie was like a carbon copy of the first one, whereas this Gremlins 2 is so very, very different than the first one. I mean, I think just the tone of this, the location, but I also want to point out, Brian, you'll love this, that there's a big trend of sequels going to New York around this time, because you have this movie, one of the Friday the 13th movies goes to New York. You also have Home Alone 2, Lost in New York. And this is something that is carrying us to even 2023, because the next Scream movie is also going to be going to New York City. So also wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, something about New York City as like a location. Look, I've never been there. I really don't want to go there. It not scares me. It just looks like it's gonna annoy the shit out of me in terms of walking around and travel. But it's a great location for filming. Like, there's no doubt about it. It's iconic, the buildings and all that kind of thing. And if you shoot it right, it looks great. Yeah, it's so weird, that time period. You know what I mean? Like that. Now that you mention, I think about it now. It's like that early '90s period, being obsessed about going to. I don't know. Maybe it's that the way that Times Square looked at the time. It was great for films. But I guess you would also tell you this other sequel coming up, Superman 4, also being using New York as a location, right?
Funny enough, that is literally what I was about to get into, as a lot of the notes pertain to what happens in the actual movie. So we're just going to kind of get into the movie itself. We open with Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, because why not? We're going to open a Gremlins movie with Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. A little bit of synergy, as this was the 50th anniversary of Bugs Bunny. Bugs and Daffy appear in the Looney Tunes open. It was meant to set the tone for the movie and say that this is going to be much more lighthearted, less dark. But Bugs and Daffy up to their usual shenanigans. And I want to point out, Brian, they got Chuck Jones, the legendary Looney Tunes director, to come out of retirement for this. So this is a big deal to have Bugs and Daffy doing their shenanigans. Brian, did you watch the post-credits scene as well?
There's a post-credit scene in Gremlins 2?
Daffy Duck was doing a little bit of commentary over the credits, and then Porky Pig attempts to do That's All, Folks, and Daffy Duck interrupts him and does it himself. And what I want to point out, Brian, there are a lot of similarities between Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Gremlins 2, The New Batch. That is one of them. The fact that both movies kind of end with That's All, Folks.
Wow, you're blowing my mind right now. Like 1990 end credit sequences. Wow. How did I not know? Well, I guess what would I know? I would never go to the end of the credits. So, holy shit. That's pretty. I wonder if the MCU took. I don't know. Probably not. But damn. Wow. You're blowing my mind right now. Amazing.
So we do open with the aerial shot of New York City. This was stock footage that was used for Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. Another movie that we have done a podcast about as part of Superhero Pantheon, and it is unfortunately a part of our pile of shame. It is genuinely one of the worst movies / superhero movies ever made. So the story of this movie is that in the first few minutes, Mr. Wing, who of course was kind of in charge of this little shop in New York City, there's a lot of real estate in this movie, and they are trying to buy his shop. He is not interested in selling, but he unfortunately passes away, and this means that Gizmo is being taken to a New York City skyscraper, taken to a lab. I think one of the weaknesses of this movie is that we never get a sense of like the organization, the geography of the skyscraper and like where different things are. And I think especially having watched Die Hard very recently, where the geography of that building is so very, very clear, like they very clearly say where different things are. And I really like that. And yes, I understand that this is a comedy. I understand this is meant to be a farce, but one of the things that I would have loved to have seen a better idea of is like, where is this lab located relative to some of the offices that Billy works in, or the spaces that Kate works in. So that's just something that I would have really appreciated coming into this. But yeah, any thoughts on kind of the first few minutes and kind of the setup as Gizmo is Gizmo's very much the protagonist of this movie, it seems, more so than Billy and Kate.
Yeah, I mean, he is the focus right off the bat. And I don't know, I'd always thought it was weird that, like, they destroyed the store with everything inside of it. I thought that was so fucked up, even as a kid. Because, like, I've closed out a Blockbuster or two in my day, back in the day. And you don't just, like, go in there and demolish the building with all the stuff inside still. So I thought that was like a weird thing, but I guess it's part of the joke, right? Like the total disrespect of the old man. He dies and they just go in there and just demolish everything, and poor Gizmo's got to sneak out this hole in the back wall. Oh man, unbelievable. Still, the effects though, like Gizmo's effects are just so practically well done, even for like him moving around the streets of New York for like 30 seconds. But yeah, then the twin. Okay, they're not clones. We'll talk about this later, but they're not clones. They're twins. Pick up Gizmo. And it made me think, like, so the dad in the first one went to this shop, right? So he went to New York and then went back to Billy, and then Billy went to the big city as well. So interesting. I didn't really like pick up on that the store was actually in New York. I thought it was like I don't know, somewhere else. But so that kind of ties in with the first one, obviously. And then, you know, I don't know what the guy wanted to buy from. I think he wanted to buy the building itself, right? Or did he want to buy Gizmo?
He wanted to buy the building himself because this was a real estate deal. Because
he doesn't even know about Gizmo. Okay, yeah.
The long story is that John Glover plays Daniel Clamp, who is very much based on Donald Trump. And before Donald Trump was the president of the United States, like the thing about him was that he was very much a real estate guy. Like that's what The Art of the Deal is about. You see that there's kind of a parody book of that. So that is who John Glover is intended to be. He's intended to be this yuppie, a slightly more yuppified version of a Trump-like character. So you mentioned they go into the lab. Here's where we are introduced to Christopher Lee. Now, you mentioned you wanted Peter Cushing to be the voice. Do you realize what the name of Christopher Lee's doctor is?
I think I missed that, but I know it's some kind of weird tie-in that Joe Dante loves to do.
Dr. Cushing Catheter.
There you go. See? You see? There you go. Like, okay, maybe they just couldn't get him, and I understand that because he only had, I mean, he was like, you know, in his 90s, like their late 80s, but still, like, maybe it was written for him, because when I see that role now, I just picture Peter Cushing going, because I've seen some Hammer horror movies where he just goes off on people he thinks are less intelligent than him and just goes off on this intelligent rant. And that's what the brain gremlin was almost doing. So I kind of pictured like maybe they wrote this for him and they just couldn't get him because of his physical state. But man, I kind of wish that was it, but like they just waited too long. But, you know, because people don't realize Christopher Lee is like a lot younger than Peter Cushing was. So that's why he's still like so.
But even at this point, 1990, Christopher Lee is in his 60s. I mean, he died in his 90s, and he was in his late 80s, early 90s. He was in the Star Wars prequels and the Lord of the Rings movies. I think that's where people most closely associate with Christopher Lee. But he had an entire career of these very low budget horror movies. He, of course, was in a James Bond movie. He is, of course, kind of lampooning his persona a bit in this movie as well. There are also Dan and Don Stanton. They play Martin and Lewis, very clearly an homage to Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. But Don and Dan Stanton are Dr. Catheter's assistants. They are twins. I most closely associate them with Terminator 2. One of them plays a cop and the other a great use of twins, as the other one plays T-1000. As one twin murders the other in the movie. It's there were actually two uses of twins in Terminator 2. Linda Hamilton's twin as well was a part of that. So but they both get to act in this movie, and everything is very heightened. Everything is very comedic. We get eventually to see Billy and Kate. Billy and Kate, of course, were in the first film as kind of the lead protagonists. They are not married yet, but they are boyfriend and girlfriend. I would classify them. They are working in the skyscraper. They're both in the skyscraper working, but they're kind of lower level. And one of Billy Peltzer's co-workers, perhaps supervisors, basically is sexually harassing him. I don't want to focus too much on the storyline because the movie barely cares about it. But here's what I'm going to say about poor Zach Gilligan and Phoebe Cates. They are in the first movie. I think they do a solid job of, like, they're teenagers, like they're in this comedy horror movie. I think they do a good job. In Gremlins 2, I don't think that they are acting in Gremlins 2. They are still acting as if it is the first Gremlins movie. And I don't know that their performances are necessarily calibrated with the type of movie this is, especially Phoebe Cates.
Yeah, I get that, because it seems like because of their experience with the Gremlins in the first one, they know what's coming, and like they the way everyone else is acting is kind of like the way people reacted when they first met the Gremlins in the first one, which is, which totally makes sense. So them being used to it, going through the motions, and then especially Phoebe Cates feels like she's like, oh God, we're going through this again, and she's just kind of like, okay, I know what to do now, and blah blah blah. But man, I swear to God, when I saw this movie as a kid, I think I fell in love with Phoebe Cates. Like, man, she was like one of my first childhood crushes. And it's probably because of this movie. Credit to I think her husband for 30 years is Chris Klein. Am I correct on that? But still, like, good for him, because he won in life with that one. But man, yeah, Phoebe Cates, big time childhood crush. And then seeing those two, like, in the building, it made me think, like, wow, they're really struggling. It made me think they're struggling, but maybe they're not struggling. And then it kind of puts the building in perspective. Like, wow, this building is so wacky. Like, they have an art department, they have a TV department, they have a mall with a Spencer's Gifts and a giant food court. Like, what the fuck is going on here? But, later on, I've heard stories about the CNN building or whatever that Turner building is back in the day, from, like, Tony Schiavone talking about it when the WCW people were there, and how there's like a giant food court or whatever. And, like, it's got giant TV studios and, like, tours and stuff like that. So I think they based that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been to CNN Center in Atlanta, Brian,
so it's
that's exactly what it is.
Okay, yeah. So that's what I was like as a kid. Like, what the hell kind of building is this? Because there's no building like that even now in LA, to my knowledge. Like, so as a kid, I'm like, man, this place is like not a wonderland, but like a fantasy land. You know what I mean? But then it turns out later on, you find out that there's buildings like this. And it's like, holy shit, people are just all over the place in this building doing different things, which, it's just kind of random. You know what I mean? And everyone has a job. But I do love the fact that the gimmick of everything not working, which ties into the first movie, because the Peltzer's dad being a failed, not failed, but a bad inventor. So that kind of ties into this one. I almost thought they were going to bring out the dad and show that he was kind of like the liaison, or like the behind the scenes guy, like the tech in the building, as to why it's all not working. But they didn't do that. But I did love the jokes, and video conference calls in 1990. That's pretty freaking dope, because we get that now with Skype. So they pretty much got that, down. But that building, man, it's still in my head. It's like this technological wonder that doesn't really exist, but kind of does. And I always wonder what's at the top of the building, because we never actually get to the top of the building. But again, it's just, and also the lab.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too. That's one of the things I thought they were going to pay off, was like, what is at the top of this building. But what does happen is we get Billy trying to save Gizmo, and hijinks ensue. And that is probably the understatement of the century, given what happens. So the first half hour of this movie, okay, there's sort of a plot. Like, there's sort of like, it's kind of the setup for a sequel. And then the movie just completely goes off the rails. And Brian, just as John Astin sent our favorite crazy family to Europe for European vacation, he is back again as part of the series. This time he is the janitor who violates one of the rules and gets Gizmo wet. Brian, I know you had to mark out when you saw John Astin again, especially after Gizmo says the word Gomez.
Yeah, just weird stuff because I completely forgot about this when we put our list together. Well, we put our list together at the end of December. We pretty much finalized it. And then, of course, I remember John Aston right off the bat as the host of the game show. But then I completely forgot he's the janitor that gets Gizmo wet. And let's just say this: as a janitor, I think he's a failure. I think he just made the water situation worse, and then I almost thought he ruined Billy's painting at first too. But I guess pastels or whatever didn't really mess up the colors or whatever. But poor Gizmo, man, because my thinking too was that the reason that like the little baby gremlins came out like black and white is because the colors got mixed with the water. That's what I always thought as a kid, but apparently it has nothing to do with that. But I thought it was interesting that like I don't know, it was just weird that the painting easel and the way that the water drips down. I don't know. Does that interpret in your head the way that I just said? Like it's the reason that they're off colored is because of the paint, or is that just me?
I don't know if it's necessarily the paint, but the way that I saw it is that like Gizmo is the original, and then what ends up slowly happening is like it's like a copy of a copy of a copy. So you see some deterioration as you get further down the line. Like basically there's a point when Kate takes I'm going to call him a dollar store version of Gizmo because he's completely out of control and doesn't have like he's all id basically. And so you get that, and then you get the ones that are just scales and there's no hair on them whatsoever. And again, things just get crazier and crazier. So I want to run down some of the things that happen. This is not necessarily going to be in order because this almost doesn't matter. But there is a point when Leonard Maltin himself comes on and they are talking about the 1984 Gremlins, Brian. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about our final movie. But in a lot of ways, this movie is kind of a deconstruction of the first one because they respond to many of the criticisms. They respond to some of the things that happened, which we'll get into. But Leonard Maltin in this movie is he is ranting and raving about the 1984 Gremlins, and then he is eaten by the Gremlins. He referred to in his movie guide as this scene as a gratuitous cameo, which is pretty funny. So I don't think that a film critic should actually be in a movie ever, but what an interesting moment this was to have somebody talking about the 1984 Gremlins and then literally get eaten and destroyed by the Gremlins.
Yeah, this is the one scene I think that if I were to cut a scene out, it'd be that one because it's just so confusing. And like when I saw this as a kid, I was like, so that's the first movie? But then how is the first movie in this movie? And I always thought that as a kid, but then after a while you just kind of ignore it and then just skip to the next scene. So it really threw me off as a kid because I was so, especially if I'd never seen the first one at that time. And I'm like, so I know there's a first movie, but they're advertising the movie within the movie. So it really threw me off. But again, they're trying to be tongue in cheek and meta and kind of clap back at the critics. I get it, but it's one of those scenes that I could easily skip because it's fun, but not like hilarious. You know what I mean? And Leonard Maltin is not really like a funny guy anyway. So it's just
no, he's not. Unfortunately, his health is not in good shape right now. But
yeah, it's just I mean, a lot of the movie critics from that era were not necessarily going for like the hard comedy lines and the hard insults, you know, the way that some of these clickbait sites do on some of their reviews, you know what I mean? So I get what they were going for, but it seems out of place and I could easily just do away with it if I had to.
I mean, there's a lot of craziness. So this is probably my favorite scene because I think if they were to do this scene now, it would be them yelling at like fanboys. When Billy is trying to explain the rules regarding the Mogwai. So the 3 rules, Brian, are what? Do you remember those 3 rules?
No eating after midnight, no water, and no sunlight.
Yeah, those are the 3 rules. So they are the other people. They are trying to poke holes. They find the rules absurd and interrogate him on the application of these rules. And Billy is just like in Scream. He just wants to go by the rules. He just wants to save Gizmo, wants to get him out of the building, doesn't want to get him wet, doesn't want to feed him after midnight. And the filmmakers themselves saw the rules as irrational, and there were a lot of questions. But then the best part is the payoff. The guy's like lambasting Billy, like he is doxing him in real life. And then a gremlin comes out of the machine and just bites his neck and kills him. And I was cackling at this scene, Brian. I loved it so much because it's a great way to kind of respond to some of the criticisms, have some fun, kind of have your cake and eat it too. But this is one of the best scenes in the movie.
This is definitely, like, I think for me, the scariest scene, because when I saw this the first time as a kid, you don't see what's coming at all. It's not just any normal gremlin. It's Stripe, the spiky one, you know what I mean? And it's just, oh my God, the way that he's designed, and it's almost like this, like, almost like these fish type spikes on the back, and it's like a very creative design, and he ends up being kind of like the lead, or one of the lead gremlins. But him popping out of the machine was just so incredible. Like, even now, it's just like you're waiting for it, and you're waiting for the timing, and then it happens, and then everyone is in shock. But then it goes back to some comedy with some jokes after the whole episode. So it's just like, wow, man, they really got you, and they kind of bring back the horror a little bit, but then they kind of bring it down again with like the gremlin punching the dude and then running away, and like the security lead guy just takes the flashlight out of the woman's hands because he's just an asshole, and just like, okay, man, we're in for a ride, because that was like the start of it all, you know what I mean? Like the start of like, oh my God, here we go. It's just gonna go down today. And yeah, it's one of my most memorable scenes in the franchise, and it kind of ties in with the idea of gremlins in general, because in World War I, World War II, whatever, the whole legend of the gremlin is it's inside your machinery and it's screwing things up. So it literally came out of the fucking computer and attacked the guy. So that kind of tied into that as well. So I thought it was overall like a well done placement of a gremlin and very well used. And it scared the shit out of me as a kid, for sure.
All right, we have to talk about this scene as well. So there's a point in the movie, director Joe Dante attempted to involve his audience in the story by making it seem as if the Gremlins had taken over whatever theater in which the movie would be screened. This was inspired by a similar stunt in another movie, William Castle's The Tingler. During his DVD commentary for the movie, Dante recalled that Warner Brothers wanted the sequence cut as they were concerned the audience would believe the film actually had malfunctioned. Test screening ultimately proved otherwise. There is a VHS version that is John Wayne's voice, but in this movie, Brian, I know you had to pop for this, because in this movie the Gremlins disrupt the theater, and people are not able to see it. So who do they call upon to correct this and to threaten the Gremlins? Hulk Hogan is appearing as himself in a very short cameo. So we have Hulk Hogan wearing the WWF Championship belt. The movie came out in June of 1990. Brian, who was the WWF champion in June of 1990?
Ultimate Warrior, but they obviously filmed it beforehand, so I think
I'm very sad that the Ultimate Warrior.
Come on, no, that would not have worked. Hogan worked.
Can you imagine? I'm not saying it would have worked. I'm just saying the Ultimate Warrior cutting a warrior-like promo in this movie would have been hilarious.
I mean, yeah, but it would have been. Oh my God, I get you. Believe me, I get you. And the parts unknown stuff, and yeah, the little warriors out there, and yeah, I get you. But I think Hogan was the right choice because he's able to just spit out dialogue that's given to him and not go off the rails and just take whatever.
I mean, it's
yeah.
Funny you say that, because I actually think that that's one of Hogan's weaknesses. Like, you see the charisma when he's cutting one of his whack-a-loon promos, like when he's like seemingly on cocaine and just off his rails. Like, you watch some of those promos and you see the charisma, and then you see him like read scripted dialogue in any movie that he's in, and it just doesn't work, man. And like, I think it's fine here because he's in the movie for like a minute, but even in this one scene, like, it feels off.
I don't know if it's just because they're directing him or not, because of course, when you see old WWF stuff, it's like they're directing from behind the curtain or whatever, but it's just a different setup, you know what I mean? And the fact that he's holding popcorn and a soda, adds to it. I can't remember if he was in the VHS version, because obviously that was the first version I saw, but I do remember the VHS screwing up and thinking like, what's going on. I do remember like the first time that happened, I did the tracking thing on the VHS or the VCR, and I was like, what's going on? And then I made it worse, and then I had to rewind it and watch it through and realize, oh, it's part of the movie. So they got me. So I'm pretty sure there were some mom and pops out there who were like, what the fuck is going on? And they complained to the manager or whatever. And then they just went back and they realized, oh, it's part of the movie. So I enjoy that because it kind of ties into this whole idea of the Gremlins going meta, right? Because they're talking to Leonard Maltin about the first movie. And then this happens where they're breaking the fourth wall again. But it also it's supposed to be a throwback, I think, to the scene where they're watching Cinderella. Or was it? No, Snow White in the first one. So it kind of ties into all of that. And you know what I mean? And the fact that there's no movie theater in the building, they probably wanted to add this, do you know what I mean? To like, hey, let's get a movie theater again and have the Gremlins run a projector. And this was their excuse to do it because obviously there was no movie theater in that building. I mean, they could have added one for sure, but you know what I mean? But I think they just wanted to play off the joke from the first one.
Immediately after this, there was a mother scolding the theater manager regarding the movie's inappropriate tone for children, and this is also based on something that Joe Dante went back. So there's a lot of clapping back that is going on. So the Gremlins are creating a lot of chaos, and the Gremlins are drinking various chemicals, as Brian mentioned. We kind of get a Batman Gremlin, which is very clearly a shout out to the 1989 Batman movie that had come out the year before. So some synergy there. We also kind of have a spider one, his name is Mohawk. And it's funny that this movie is so closely tied to the history of Warner Brothers. Batman 1989 was such a huge deal, one of the biggest moneymakers in their history. And as a way, one of the things that Warner Brothers did not want is they did not want the movie Dick Tracy to break some of the box office records of Batman 1989. So Gremlins 2: The New Batch opened against Dick Tracy, and it likely hurt the box office prospects of both, as this movie had a much more significant budget, and it seemingly either lost a little bit of money or broke even in terms of its theatrical release. And Dick Tracy, of course, also did not do well, even though it was kind of a critical mixed reception. But it's funny to think about all the ways that this movie connects to kind of Batman and the history of Warner Brothers.
Yeah, because I thought that too. Like, I forgot the Looney Tunes part, and then when I watched it at the beginning, I'm like, oh man, this plus the Batman stuff, like and plus the Superman 4 footage, they really tie in the history of Warner Brothers in this movie up to that point. Even like, I know you probably don't like The Burbs. Do you like The Burbs, or have you even seen it?
I don't think I've even seen it.
Okay, because that's Joe Dante the year before, and that was the year of the writer's strike, and that. From what I've read, like I enjoy that movie a lot, but you can tell like a lot of the actors were kind of like making up their own dialogue because they only had like half a script or something. But I mean, the security guard that finds Billy is actually one of the stars of The Burbs, and I think there's another cameo too from The Burbs that I forgot. But again, like tying in the history, and you know, The Burbs has become kind of a cult classic in my opinion. So with Tom Hanks, and so. There's all these connections, you know, through Joe Dante, and he's bringing back these old actors, you know what I mean? Especially the guy that plays the old neighbor, I'm blanking on his name right now, Dick something. He's in like almost in every Joe Dante movie. Even I think Small Soldiers, I think he was the guy that owned the toy store, I think. And then a little connecting back to Hogan. What other Hogan cameo do you remember? Wait, no, was it Looney Tunes or Muppets? I'm thinking of Muppets, I'm sorry, but I think he was in Looney Tunes as well, back in
Muppets
action.
in Space, yes.
But I think he was in Looney Tunes back in action as well, I think, or something. But
I'm not sure, but I know that's like one of Joe Dante's like last kind of bigger movies before he's been mostly in TV the last few years.
Yeah, so he's always trying to connect his old movies to the previous ones, and then we talk about the movie theater. Like his next movie after this was Matinee, and I remember watching Matinee as a kid in the theater and just being confused as to what this was. And not really understanding it until years later. But again, that love for cinema and the projector, pretty much, you know what I mean? I guess that's Joe Dante's kind of like thing. So
I mean, it's still something that plays a factor in movies today. I mean, we have Empire of Light, we have The Fabelmans by Steven Spielberg, who's one of the executive producers of this movie. So something that is also happening is the Gremlins. They are just bullying poor Gizmo throughout. I mean, it's pretty mean spirited. Like they run a train into him, and they're just being awful. So There's a point when Gizmo sees the movie Rambo. I believe it's Rambo 2 on the TV, and Gizmo at one point goes to imitate Rambo in this movie and even fires an arrow it's whiteout, but it burns one of the gremlins, and that's kind of the payoff. So I think that one of the things that I don't think necessarily works, unfortunately, is they are bullying Gizmo so bad. It sucks that he's not more involved in the third act. Would you agree?
I mean, to me, he's the savior of the day, right? Because he destroyed the spider.
Like
thing.
in that moment, yes, but it just feels like he should have been even more involved in like what they do, which we'll get into in a couple minutes. But
it might have been a visual effects thing too, because he's so limited on what you can do with the puppet that size, and they couldn't CGI a lot of his action. They had to like physically show the action with practical effects of what Gizmo was doing and taking that. I'll always remember the paperclip, because I always tried to do that as a kid, to turn a paperclip into a small bow and arrow thing, shooting a pencil, and I was never able to pull it off. And then I realized there was as I grew older, I realized there was bigger paperclips than the normal size one, and I realized that's the one that he was using, the bigger one, for like heavy size stock paper. So I've always tried it. I've never successfully launched a pencil from a paperclip as a bow and arrow to this day, but goddamn, I tried 100 times at least to do that, trying to redo Gizmo doing that, but I can never do it. Really quick though, who is do you know the composer of the Rambo movies, the music composer offhand?
It's Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry Goldsmith did the composing for the Rambo movies. He is also the composer for this movie, and
yeah. And did you
I
notice
think it is
they
one
played
of
the
the best
Rambo
parts of the
theme?
movie.
Did you notice they played the Rambo theme when Gizmo was doing the prep work? Oh God, I never noticed that until now, man. So yeah, that was a great little. I was like, oh my God, that's the Rambo theme. How did I never notice that? So yeah, just more love for previous other movies, and yeah, that's kind of what Joe Tante was doing. He's pretty much doing like a love letter to like old movies and Warner Brothers, and an ode to Hammer Horror with Christopher Lee and all that stuff, and all that stuff just thrown into a blender and coming out as like a whole movie.
So this is by no means comprehensive, but there's two more aspects of this movie in terms of the plot that I want to hit upon. The first of which is, so we are seemingly ready for the final act, like we're ready for the big climax of this movie. And Brian, what do we get? We get a 3-minute song. We get the Gremlins, specifically, I believe it's the Brain Gremlin. They are singing New York, New York. Brian, this was, now unwillingly, I had watched New York, New York by Martin Scorsese just a couple weeks earlier. Just not out of nowhere, but I bought the Blu-ray because it is not available on streaming. So I wanted to have a physical copy because I had never seen it. So to see this scene after watching New York, New York, it was absolutely wonderful. Just a pure delight to see the Gremlins singing New York, New York.
Yeah, man, the Brain Gremlin, credit to him. I got to look up his name really quick, but he did an awesome job.
It is Tony Randall who provided the voice, and
right.
I know you wanted Peter Cushing, but Tony Randall, I think, did a very good job.
He did a very good job, and him leading the song and the charge, just like that was just tremendous, and all the Gremlins dancing. Like they figured, like how do we have a fun ending and not blow them up? But instead they kind of like melted them this time, which I thought was a creative way to do that. Which kind of has like a goof because it leaves the electrical gremlin in the open and he doesn't really die, and plot hole, but whatever. Yeah, that whole sequence.
I mean, but it pays off. It pays off.
It does pay off, but we don't know if that electrical gremlin is dead. You know what I mean? Like officially, because he was the electricity, but. Yeah, anyway, and then the random thing with the female gremlin and the whole like dance routine changing midway, just like it took a lot of creativity to come up with that stuff, man. And I loved every minute of it. And I don't care if it doesn't make sense, because in this reality and what's going on with this building on that day, it's just part of the craziness, and it worked for me.
I mentioned the connections to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and I want to point out a couple of them. Just the sounds that they were making, very reminiscent of the Weasels, and some of the antics and some of the shenanigans. We did get a Wilhelm scream, of course. Even more specifically to me is the ending. So they want to destroy the Gremlins with sunlight, but of course, just as they are about to do so, just like nothing in this movie works, even the weather doesn't work, as it is going to be cloudy and rainy. So what do? They decide to spray all the gremlins with water, and then they use the kind of electrical gremlin to electrify them and melt them down. We even get a Wizard of Oz connection, just like Roger Rabbit, where he talks about, "Oh, I'm melting! What a world!" So this can't be a coincidence, of course. I would say. And this is how they defeat the Gremlins and prevent them from escaping out into New York. I can imagine a scenario now where they would really just blow up the budget and they would send the Gremlins out into the city and raise a lot of hell there. That's what I could see, which is interesting because we're gonna come back to this topic a little bit next week. A little bit of a tease for the sequel we are discussing next week.
Yeah, I wanted that so bad, but again, it's 1990, so you can only do so much, and I think limited to the building helps a lot in terms of controlling the budget and the expenses. Because once they go out into the open, the only time they go out in the open was the Bat Gremlin, and that looked expensive because it's the flying bat. So you got to do it wasn't CGI, it was like stop motion. But it looked great, you know what I mean? And it fit what they were doing. You would think that'd be the setup for a third movie, which, would never happen, which may be a good thing. But yeah, I think if they did a third movie, that would have been the plot. Because I think the idea is you want to see him go in a big city and just go all over the place, right? But again, that's a lot of money and a lot of detail and a lot of extras, a lot of extras with a lot of gremlins on their back. So they kind of reduced it because the first movie, I would say the first movie, they try to do that, but it's a whole town, right? In this case, I like it that it's everything's in the building because it kind of gets that claustrophobic feel, especially when Phoebe Cates is in the elevator and it's just going nuts, and then all the gremlins are on the outside of the elevator freaking her out and sticking their hand in there and trying to grab her. And I was like, that was a freaky scene as a kid. But then when she goes free falling and destroys all the gremlins, man, in the elevator, I was like, holy shit, that was awesome. So you couldn't really do that if you go and explore the city. I mean, you could in different buildings, but it wouldn't be, you know what I mean? As cool, I think, especially the gimmick is that the building is not working and malfunctions. It fit the tone of what they were trying to do. So I like that they kind of confined it to the building. But yeah, I think it would be awesome if they could do a third movie now and kind of explore and go throughout the world. But then we got that with Jurassic Kingdom. So I don't know if that's a good or bad thing anymore.
So what then happens is John Glover as Daniel Clamp sees Gizmo and wants to have some marketing opportunities, including putting Gizmo as something that you would hang in your car. Did your family have a Gizmo hanging in their car? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Are you talking about the rip-off Furbies? Yes, because we had Furbies, and I collected some. But I was just laughing because
they were things they had suck.
Actual
cups on their
Gizmo
hands.
suction cups. Wow, I never had that. I thought you were referring to
everybody
the fact that
either had
ripped
a
off Gizmo.
Garfield. Everybody either had a
I
Garfield.
remember the Garfield ones a lot. I never had them, but I saw so many of those in the early 1990s. Now that you mentioned it, but I mean, let's face facts here. The Furbies ripped off Gizmo, right? That's kind of what they look like anyway. And so when I was thinking, when he said that, I was like, oh shit, he kind of foreshadowed what was going to happen with the Furbies, and then now with Baby Yoda, right? And that's kind of the same thing that's going on, except Disney's way really behind that Baby Yoda train to get that money. So I felt like Warner Brothers kind of slightly missed the boat in terms of marketing Gizmo, but I think he's kind of the Gizmo character's kind of had this comeback in the last 10, 15 years. And then the last couple of years, I think, especially since that Mountain Dew commercial where everyone freaked out when they brought the original Billy back and the Gizmo back, which I think was a missed opportunity because you can tell people wanted it and they still didn't make it. But I don't know if there's something in production now or they're just kind of having it behind closed doors at Warner Brothers in terms of making a third.
There is going to be a Gremlins animated series, I guess, that maybe even coming out this year. So that is probably the closest thing that we're going to get to a Gremlins 3.
I guess so, man. I don't know. I guess it's probably best that they waited this long. I mean, look at Top Gun, right? They waited 30 plus years to make the sequel, and it's one of the best sequels of all time. So I get it. Sometimes waiting is worth it, and I hope that they go practical and don't necessarily just lean into the CGI, because then you kind of like, I don't know, you lose some of that magic, or a lot of that magic, I should say. Because let's face it, the practical effects is kind of what makes this movie special. You know what I mean? And the designs and everything. So much credit to that. And then I guess we kind of forgot already to mention, what's his name? Clampett. He's my favorite performance in this whole movie, but he does a great job, man. And I think you mentioned him trying to be Trump. It's sort of a mix of Trump and Turner, but it's weird because I don't see Trump as much, because this character of Clampett actually cares about people and wanting to make money, but he does care.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing, because he's not necessarily like, they can't decide whether he's a bad guy or a good guy. So at the very beginning, like, he's very clearly a bad guy, but then he's not as terrible. But like in the end, he still wants to market and promote Gizmo. So he's very clearly not a good guy. I think they were going for a Trump Turner vibe for sure. I also want to point out that we had the return of the Futtermans as well, and that was also a great performance.
Dick Miller, that's the actor that I was trying to mention earlier. He's in like in almost every Joe Dante movie.
He's very good. Like, if they had made Spider-Man in 1990, he would have been Uncle Ben.
Oh my God! Don't say that now. Oh my God! Oh my God! That would have been incredible. Oh my God!
He absolutely could have said, "With great power comes great responsibility."
I hear it right now in my head. It would have been perfect. And hell, Billy could have been maybe not Spider-Man, but
no, not at all.
Yeah,
his performance is not great.
It's okay.
All
I
right,
think it's the first one.
The strengths of this movie, I would say the look and design of the Gremlins are incredible. Like, just the meticulous effort that is put into every Gremlin. The design of the female Gremlin is also pretty hilarious. It's fantastic stuff. Like, the movie is almost worth watching just because it is almost all practical. I love it. We haven't really talked about the Jerry Goldsmith score. It's very good. I mean, even in Supergirl, a movie that's not great, Jerry Goldsmith he's one of the best ever to do this. The older actors, they know what movie they're in. Christopher Lee, Dick Miller, Stanton's, like, the older actors absolutely live up to what this movie is. John Glover as well. Like, you could definitely see they know what they're doing. I think they do a great job with the meta humor. I think they do a great job kind of making fun of Warner Brothers. Like, there's a point when one of the Gremlins is literally branded with a Warner Brothers thing on his chest. It works out so well. And yeah, those are my strengths. Brian, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think you're right about the older actors being the better performers, and that's just kind of like I don't know if it's by default, but that's just kind of like aging with time and, you know, crafting your craft, whatever. But I would say John Glover just like came out of nowhere in this movie and just became this like, wow, this guy's giving this great performance that I'm not sure is justified for the material that this is, but it made it seem like, okay, this guy's like, you know, acting in a different movie, it seems like, but he's just really into this role. And him walking around trying to figure out what to do when he's bored at the office, I thought was hilarious, because it's the little things that I like about character actors and the things they do. And him just having his hand in his pocket, just walking around like, ooh, let's do some memos. Like, you're so bored that you have to come up with memos. You know what I mean? Like, I thought that was hilarious. And I think everyone, in terms of the older actors, did a great job. I would even say, like, Gade Watanabe is the cameraman. I've seen him in other stuff as well, but I thought he did a great job for just being like this guy that's kind of like obsessed with like showing the news, and like one of those people that is just like determined to show news all the time. So yeah, I thought that was great, and he always had the camera with him, and he did a great job as well.
All right, the weaknesses: Zach Galligan and Phoebe Cates are just not up to being in this version of Gremlins. It's a very different movie, and you could see why these two kind of petered out in terms of their career, because they just weren't very good. I mean, it sucks, but yeah, they're in a very different movie than what's happening. I wanted more clear geography, and I wanted Gizmo to get to do more. Like, I think of those, and again, I know it's hard because Gizmo is a puppet, but I just would have liked to have seen some kind of a payoff a little bit better. Those are my weaknesses. Anything to add, Brian?
I would say the Leonard Maltin scene, because that always throws me off because of the weird meta-ness of it all. Overall, I would say like it sticks the landing in terms of like handling the tone with the comedy, having the slight bits of horror, but like I would say PG-13 level horror, like when the gremlin pops out and scares the shit out of you from that computer. So yeah, those are kind of like my weaknesses. Like I wouldn't say like this is like in terms of a script, I would throw that out the window because this is not a movie you focus like on the script and the writing. It's all about the characters, the visuals, the effects, the comedy. So if you can get past like the weird script of it all and the weird like plot holes, like the missing like not all the gremlins are dead, by the way. There's still the female gremlin and like I mentioned that electrical gremlin that seemed to disappear after they electrocuted everyone. So there's some plot holes obviously, but yeah, I just that Leonard Maltin thing always throws me off, but I do love this movie too so much because I think I love it more than the first because it's so wacky and fun that it's like one of those movies I just put on. It's like one of those comfort movies for me. So ever since I was like 3 or 4 years old when I first watched this, it's always been like a comfort movie for me. And you could always put it on and like as like a family thing and still have people react to it.
I would agree with you. For me, the MVP of this movie, it's got to be Joe Dante to have the temerity to do something that is so different. And I think with our first two sequels, they were much more traditional in the fact that they were of a piece of the previous movie. Like there is a direct connection, even though there's some differences between Vacation and European Vacation. Like they're very much the same in tone and in terms of a lot of the similar casting. Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is very much a horror movie in the vein of the first Nightmare on Elm Street, even though there are some differences. They are very much of the same piece. I think there are a couple sequels, and even the one that we're talking about next week, the tone is a little bit different. And this one, I think all of it is driven by Joe Dante. For that reason, he is the MVP, the best performance. I'm going to give it to Christopher Lee. There really aren't, like, again, the fact that our two lead performers are not very good really hinders this category. So almost by default, it's Christopher Lee, even though I could almost give it to the puppeteers in charge of the Gremlins because they are arguably a co-MVPs of this movie because of the work that they're doing in operating the Gremlins. But we kind of have to give it to a human performer. So I'm going to give it to Christopher Lee. Is this underrated? Yeah, it is. I mean, I think this movie, if it is not as good as Gremlins, it is very, very close.
Yeah, MVP Joe Dante. I'm not going to call this the best performance category just for this movie. It's going to be called the best character actor of this movie, and definitely John Glover as Daniel Clamp. I mean, he's in the CW shows nowadays, and he's a great, reliable character actor for TV shows. If you need a heavy or like that, older person to give that wise man kind of advice or whatever. So I think he does a great job here, and he kind of steals the show a little bit for me because I always remember him more as a kid because of like him destroying the gremlin at the copy machine and then kind of acting like, okay, we got to get past this now. You know what I mean? Like we got to fix this problem. So he stood up for me the most in terms of performance. Underrated, definitely. I can't believe that this was like considered like not bad, but like not a good movie. You know what I mean? And growing up, I was like, God, this movie's a classic. How is this like underrated? So when Jerome put it on the list, I was like, you think it's underrated? And I'm like, and we had this discussion, but then we were like, okay, I guess it is underrated based on what the critics say and then the legacy of the movie. Because I would say this is like a comfort movie for 80s babies, 90s babies. You know what I mean? Nowadays, I don't know if it kind of connects with that Gen Z audience, but maybe you need that third movie or cartoon or whatever to reintroduce it because if they love Baby Yoda, I mean, they're going to love Gizmo. And everyone loved that Mountain Dew commercial. So it's just kind of like, I feel like the answer's there. It's just we got to get to that third movie or cartoon or whatever. But it's all about, connecting with the audience.
Absolutely. So we will be taking a look at a different movie next week that is a Brian pick. Again, just the way that it worked out in terms of we are doing these in chronological order. So Brian will be taking on the next two. We will be staying in the Steven Spielberg universe, Brian, but we will be fast forwarding a few years. So why don't you tease what we're doing next week?
Not going to reveal it, but let's just say Steven Spielberg took a 4-year break after releasing Jurassic Park and Schindler's List in the same year and came back with this movie that, I don't know, I loved it as a kid. I've seen some mixed reviews on YouTube. Some nostalgically love it. Some just kind of like, oh, it's not as good as the original, and it's like a failed comparison. So we'll talk about it next week, but I'm really excited because I have seen this movie at least 15 times, like a bunch as a kid, and then a bunch and then when the first DVD release came out of it, I watched it a bunch of times then too. So yeah, I really love this movie. We're going to talk about it next week. I'm not going to reveal it, but
Wait a minute. We're talking about Amistad next week? That's not a sequel.
oh, I see what you did there. I see what you did there. Another Damon Hadisu or whatever his name is movie in our podcasting lore. Yeah, maybe.
We will not be discussing Amistad ever, I don't think, for a number of reasons.
No. But we'll talk about a certain movie next week that I love to death, and I don't know if Jerome loves it or not, so we'll see.
All right, so for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
You know, this is not the only comedy sequel I've seen with interspecies erotica.